Each year, thousands of migrants die attempting to cross international borders without
When I
authorization.
was younger, the dream was to go and study art history, and I just wanted to be an art historian. Not even an artist, just an art historian. And I don't know where that came from.
The biggest migratory flow is known as the Central Mediterranean route. Asylum seekers, mostly from Syria or Eritrea, use Libya as a transit point as they head into the EU via Italy and Malta.
I think the first
On
time I
average,
came here,
1,500 die
I
each
would
year
be
crossing the
14
Mediterranean Sea in overloaded
and
fishing
came
boats or
back
rubber dinghies
every
run
month
by
until I left
smugglers.
West London to go to
Migrants on
university.
the eastern Mediterranean route are mostly from Syria.
So I started with
Turkey
the
into the European
gentler
Union via Greece,
ones, the constables.
southern
And constable
Bulgaria
always
or
feels like
Cyprus,
that for me. It feels like the beginning.
north via Macedonia and Serbia to reach
one's
Western
initiation
member
to
states.
It's a sort of faithful
Western
rendition of the
Mediterranean
English
route is
countryside. I get this familiarity with certain features of the English landscape. I get all of that. Turner's my guide because there's
try to cross the land borders
an act
into
of will,
Spanish territory,
imagination,
Ceuta
which is
and
at the
Melilla.
forefront.
If intercepted by border officials, migrants risk detention, deportation, or
It's what I
sometimes
call
even
his
violence.
cinematic art.
Those who reach their destination
It's a
may be
painting,
able to
but
lodge
it
an appeal for
feels
asylum.
like you're in the disaster.
Most people don't want to leave their homelands.
Everything I love
It's
in
not
Turner
like-
from the beginning is like that.
My parents did
April
it.
30th, 1975.
When you're a kid, you're made by
As Black
paintings because they
Sunday.
teach you to be
That
a human
day,
being.
North
They didn't teach me to be a
Vietnamese
black
guy
person,
telling
they
me
taught me to be a human
forcing
being.
the U.S. to abandon its embassy.
And he said,
and
slowly,
evacuate
in a really
citizens
casual
from
way,
U.S.
but it's that big
citizenship
thing.
and
That
South Vietnamese
it's a sort
allies
of
fighting
temple
were
of
lost.
whiteness.
Sometimes I still think about that.
Everywhere you look, you can see it.
We were lost.
And that whiteness is offered to
That's
you
why my dad hasn't slept
by
for 3 or 4 hours for the last
painting
6 years.
as a sort of vision of excellence.
To escape.
It's almost like a psychoanalytic
Nobody wanted
moment
us.
of becoming the very thing that you love.
Welcome to Canada.
May well be also the thing that's
Canada
keeping you in a
chose
state
us.
of discomfort about your place in the culture.
Canadians opened their borders, their homes, and their
And
hearts
so
to more than
you have to
100,000
find another
refugees
way of
fleeing
coming
persecution after
the
the
thing you
Vietnam
love.
War.
By
We were home.
embellishing it with other histories and other stories and other narratives. I became interested in making multi-screen films because it seemed a way of bringing disparate interests together. In a project in which you've shot material yourself, having archival material immediately says multiplicity or voices at work rather than a voice. I'm more choreographer than creator.
These are for those to whom history has not been friendly, for those who have known the cruelties of political becoming.
If you lived, as I did, in London, growing up as a person of color, one of the missions was to understand who you were and then by implication, make sense of that to everybody else. The essence of all experiments, be it in politics or aesthetics or narrative, is that there has to be a way in which the past, present, and the future can be brought into some sort of whole. It is impossible to overstate the significance of the sea in the formation of the African diaspora and Black identity.
And its role in history.
Vertigo Sea
slavery,
was made up
migration,
of readings
trade,
from
and conflict.
Moby Dick,
In this monumental
accounts of
three-screen
enslaved
video
Africans perishing
installation,
in the sea,
the beauty and
certainly
vitality
the
of the marine
Vietnamese boat
environment
crisis
and the abundance of
the
aquatic
70s,
life
when
are
people
brought into
tried to escape
contrast
from North
with the
Vietnam to come
destruction
to
of
Europe.
animal and human life on the seas and surrounding
It was important that it
coastlines
felt
over centuries.
episodic. When I installed Vertigo Sea at Turner Contemporary, we had a Turner, and the painting we chose was The Deluge. And it was absolutely perfect for that show because it gave Vertigo Sea a kind of godparent. It felt to me important that you had different voices to represent the ways in which disasters come at sea.
In this talk, I want to focus on the Atlantic slave trade and Britain's involvement in it in particular. Ships were the essential technology that enabled the Atlantic slave trade to flourish. Navy ships too played their part, first in protecting the trade and later carrying out anti-slavery patrols.
500 years ago, Europeans and Africans met for the first time on these shores. The encounter created the slave trade and changed the world.
Portugal was the first European power to become involved in Atlantic slavery.
The slave trade remains a missing chapter in our history. Yet Britain led the world in the exploitation of human cargo. This story is not just one of slave raiding by Europeans, but slave trading by Africans.
The Pope gave his blessing to the trade in a bull 1442.
Greed led African kings to sell 12 million people across the ocean. This is not a tale of a trade which grew by accident, but one of a global business created by royal appointment.
The Royal African Company is to be incorporated to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling and bartering of gold, silver, negroes, slaves.
This is not a tale of a dead past. It still shapes the way Britons live today.
270 leagues west of the Azores, while Spain claimed the right to dominions north and west of the line. Portugal claimed Brazil in 1500, following the arrival of Pedro Cabral, and began sending settlers to Pernambuco in the northeast of the country. The treaty also gave Portugal commercial rights in Africa. They began building forts in Gambia and along the Gold Coast to protect their interests, which included both slaves and gold. In the early 16th century, Portugal started shipping African slaves to several of its Atlantic island possessions, including the Azores, Madeira, and the Cape Verde Islands, to work on sugar and cotton production. In Brazil, settlement rapidly extended throughout the region, and the first African slaves were introduced in 1538, many being reshipped from the Atlantic islands. In the 100 years between 1551 and 1650, around 250,000 slaves arrived in Brazil, with most disembarking at either Rio de Janeiro or Salvador.
Bristol. This sleepy port was once a mercantile powerhouse, which dominated the transatlantic slave trade. Yet a visitor today sees a city stripped of any reminder of that cargo. Bristol has turned its back on the trade that made it rich.
I was simply amazed by the fact that there was no recognition that Bristol's wealth lay in the Atlantic trade. In vain I went to the museum, for example, to see whether there was a display there. Not a word of it. I looked at my university and saw whether anyone was teaching it. Not a bit of it. I talked to people in the street, and they were completely ignorant of it. And I think that when in the 20th century Bristol went through a long period of denial, there really was, as it were, participation in this wider world.
Britain is waking up to its slave trading history.
Large numbers of Negroes
The origin of
from
English
Africa,
involvement
to the
in
West
the Atlantic
Indies,
slave trade
and
is normally
the African
traced to
or
the
the
middle of the
Negro
16th
population
century.
increased, and the white population decreased.
The king was always ready to trade favours for cash. He granted a royal charter which gave a single London company, the Royal African Company, exclusive rights over the slave trade. In return, the royal family became its biggest shareholders.
A statue stood on a street named after him, in front of a tower named after him, behind which is a concert hall also named after him.
Between the 1580s and the 1630s, England began to establish colonies in the West Indies and North America. These included St. Kitts in 1624, Barbados in 1627,
The Royal African
Nevis
Company is to be incorporated in the name of our dearest brother, James, Duke of York, His Highness Prince Rupert, Anthony Earl of Shaftesbury, Henry Earl of Arlington, His Grace the Duke of Buckingham, John Earl of Bath. We hereby grant unto the same Royal African Company of England to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling, and bartering of gold, silver, negroes, slaves, goods, ware, and manufacture.
But it was the explosive growth
slavery was
in the
widely
demand for
practiced
sugar
in West Africa.
in the middle of the 17th
In most
century
African nations,
that
it was an
drove the
alternative
need
to a
for
prison
slave
system.
labour.
Those who committed crimes, convicts, could be sold into slavery. If you owed a debt, you could be sold into slavery. Sometimes through deceit, or you could be tricked into slavery.
Slaves were also acquired as captives of Africa's wars. Europeans
By
had long been
1680,
part of an established
The
system for
sugar crop
bartering.
had transformed the island.
The first
into what
Europeans
was
who came to Ghana
described
were the
as
Portuguese,
the richest colony
and they arrived in
English
1471.
America.
And when they got here,
Sugar
they found
cultivation
that
spread
there was a
rapidly
brisk trade in
other
slaves
Caribbean islands,
between Ghana
reaching
and its West
Jamaica
African neighbors.
in the early 18th
And for
century.
100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana and took part in this coastal trade, going to Senegal, bringing goods from Senegal, from Nigeria to Ghana, and bringing slaves in exchange for gold. And this was a situation before the transatlantic slave trade was introduced.
For both sides, this was just business.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be swept under the carpet.
The company found that African kings were just as greedy as England's own royal family. They were willing to supply exactly what the plantations needed.
The slave owners in the West Indies, they preferred slaves from the Gold Coast because they said these were very hard-working, hardy slaves. The Europeans themselves did not go inland to the villages or to the town to capture slaves. They remained at the forts and the castles. And it was the African traders who sold the slaves to the Europeans. Now, what happened was that there were middlemen who would meet the inland traders bringing the slaves. They would buy these slaves and then in turn resold them to the European merchants in the castles.
The transatlantic slave trade dominated West Africa. For some kingdoms, selling slaves became an economic necessity.
In the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade became the most important activity on the coast. We find that almost every town, coastal town, and almost every European fort and castle was involved in slave trading. So we have about 65 slave markets in Ghana alone.
The Africans could hardly have anticipated the consequences of all this. But the bargain they struck with the European slave traders transformed the continent. What started as a local tradition turned into a monster that eventually swallowed 12 million people.
Slavery existed in societies that had no prison systems. It was part of the punitive measures against criminal conduct, criminal behavior. The slaves lost their liberty. They went away, maybe into the neighboring state or the neighboring nation, but only for a season. It was not a long-term loss of liberty. And the children of the slaves, of course, were never slaves in that context. But here, of course, with the transatlantic slave trade, you have a final separation. People went away and they never came back.
Slavery would spirit millions away from the continent. It would be the cause of war and torment. And it would drag both Africa and Europe into a harsh new era. 18th century, the coastal towns of West Africa were making vast profits. But the price paid by Africans was enormous. The slaves were suffering treatment they had never endured before.
In the indigenous system, especially in Ghana, no slave owner had the power of life and death over the slave. But in the castle, you could do anything to the slave. You could kill the slave, you could maim the slave, you could mutilate the slave, you could punish the slave as you liked.
Cape Coast Castle in modern Ghana, the headquarters of the Royal African Company, a place of misery and terror. Slaves were packed into every space. They could be trapped here for months. There were only two ways out, to the sea and the slave ships, or to the graveyard. The forts became a byword for cruelty and rape. The Europeans' moral restraint evaporated under the African sun. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale, so the slavers supplied arms to some nations and encouraged their kings to wage war on vulnerable neighbors.
When there was peace, it means there were no captives to be sold as slaves, and therefore the slave trade would tend to decline at that particular moment. And then when there were wars, then of course the captives would be brought, and then the slave trade would be flourishing. So in a way, or to a large extent, the slave trade depended, I think, heavily
My name is
on the
John. I come from
conflicts between the local African peoples.
Many people are saying, why talk about the slave trade? We want to forget about it. It was such a terrible crime against humanity. Millions of people were sent. Again, we can't tell the number. We could talk about the number game in history. Some say 10 million, some say 12, some say 20 million, some even say 300 million Africans were sent away. And Africa was depopulated.
Identities
and all these things
are
happened.
historically
We are putting up with it right now.
If something is
compared it
constructed,
with the Nazis,
then it could be taken apart.
I think the world perhaps has not given sufficient attention to the fact that Africans had suffered a Holocaust before the Jews did.
What it does to me is just a sense of outrage, of just limitless anger.
England's royal venture had reinvented the trade in human beings. And Caribbean planters were refining a brutal new system: plantation slavery.